cold breeze swept through the bustling city streets as Emily, a frail 10-year-old with a shaved head and tired eyes, carefully arranged her paintings on a small fold-out table. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from exhaustion. Weeks of chemotherapy had left her weak, but she refused to let it dull her spirit. Every painting she sold brought her one step closer to another treatment, another chance at life. Pedestrians passed by, some offering sympathetic glances, others too lost in their own worlds to notice. Emily forced a hopeful smile as a couple stopped to admire her work, but they quickly walked away. Just as doubt crept into her mind, a shadow loomed over her tiny stand. She looked up and froze. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, stood before her, studying her paintings with an unreadable expression. What he did next left the entire street in stunned silence. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The city was alive with the hum of passing cars, distant sirens, and the rhythmic chatter of pedestrians moving with purpose. Emily sat on a small wooden stool, her frail fingers clutching a paintbrush, adding the final strokes to a sunset landscape. The fading light of the real sunset reflected on her canvas, blending reality with art. The smell of roasted peanuts and fresh bread from a nearby vendor drifted through the air, momentarily distracting her from the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She adjusted the knitted beanie, covering her bald head, a reminder of the battle she was fighting. Chemo had taken her hair, her energy, and most of her childhood, but it hadn't stolen her hope. At least, not yet. Every brushstroke was a silent prayer, every painting a desperate plea for help. She glanced at the nearly empty donation jar beside her, swallowing the lump in her throat. Will anyone stop today? Will they even care? Her mother sat a few feet away, pretending to scroll through her phone, but Emily knew she was watching, worrying. The weight of unspoken fears pressed against them both. Emily forced a smile at a passing couple who glanced at her artwork, whispered to each other, and kept walking. Maybe they think it's not good enough. Maybe I'm not good enough. She clenched her fists, frustration simmering beneath her exhaustion. The cold metal of her medical bracelet pressed against her wrist, a constant reminder of the ticking clock she was racing against. She wanted to be strong. She wanted to believe in miracles. But as the hours passed and the world continued to move around her, unnoticed and unseen, doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve. Then, out of nowhere, a shadow stretched across her paintings. Emily blinked up at the figure standing before her. His weathered face was instantly recognizable, his piercing gaze scanning her artwork with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Clint Eastwood. The air around her seemed to still, and for the first time that day, hope flickered back to life in her chest. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared up at the legendary Clint Eastwood. His sharp eyes swept over her paintings, his face unreadable. She had seen him in movies, heard his iconic voice, but never in a million years did she think he would be standing in front of her, a frail, 12-year-old girl selling artwork to survive. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise faded into the background, drowned by the sound of her own rapid heartbeat. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see right through her smile, past the brave face she had perfected. "You painted these?" His voice was rough, deliberate. Emily nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of her stool. Yeah. He crouched down to her level, picking up a small canvas of a lighthouse standing tall against a raging storm. He studied it in silence, the weight of his attention making Emily shift uncomfortably. "These are incredible," he finally said. Emily's breath hitched. Compliments weren't new to her, but hearing them from him felt different, more real. Her mother stepped forward cautiously, her eyes filled with curiosity and hope. "She paints every day. She's been selling them to help cover her chemo treatments." A flicker of something passed through Clint's eyes, something heavy. He turned back to Emily. "Chemo?" Emily swallowed hard. She hated saying it out loud, hated the pity it invited. But she nodded. "Stage 3 lymphoma." Clint let out a slow exhale, nodding as if absorbing the weight of those words. He didn't react the way most people did. No wide-eyed shock, no forced optimism, no awkward apologies. Just quiet understanding. Then suddenly, a deep voice cut through the moment. "This some kind of scam?" Emily turned to see a man in a suit, arms crossed, staring down at her paintings with a skeptical look. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't the first time someone had accused her of lying, of pretending to be sick, for sympathy. I'm not scamming anyone," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man scoffed. "Right. A little girl just happens to be out here alone, selling art to pay for chemo. Sounds convenient." Emily felt the sting of his words like a slap. Heat rose to her face, shame curling in her chest. Clint Eastwood stood up slowly. The shift in his posture was subtle, but suddenly he wasn't just an old man, he was Clint Eastwood, the legend. His piercing gaze locked onto the man. "You got a problem?" he asked, his voice low and measured. The man hesitated. "I just think..." "You think a kid would sit out here in the cold, selling art for fun?" Clint cut him off, his tone sharper now. The man faltered. The confidence drained from his face as he muttered something under his breath and walked away. Emily's eyes stung, but she refused to cry. She had learned to swallow her emotions, to stay quiet, to endure. But Clint Eastwood didn't look at her like she was someone to be pitied. He looked at her like she mattered. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she started to believe it too. Emily's hands trembled as she packed up her paintings. The encounter with the skeptical man still echoed in her head, his words like a sharp thorn in her confidence. She wasn't a liar. She wasn't scamming anyone. But the doubt, the humiliation, it stung. Clint Eastwood was still standing there, watching her. She could feel his gaze, steady and unreadable. "You okay, kid?" She forced a nod. "Yeah, happens a lot." Clint's jaw tightened. "People really think you're making this up?" Emily shrugged, but her throat burned. "Some do. They say I look too healthy to be sick." The truth was, she hated how much energy it took to be out here. Some days, the nausea was unbearable. Some days, she barely had the strength to hold a paintbrush. But she pushed through because she had to. Because the hospital bills kept coming, and her mom's exhausted face haunted her at night. Clint exhaled through his nose, deep in thought. Then, he did something unexpected. He pulled out his wallet, peeled off a few crisp $100 bills, and held them out to her. Emily's stomach twisted. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't take handouts." Clint arched an eyebrow. "It's not a handout. It's payment." She frowned. "For what?" He picked up the lighthouse painting again. "For this, and any others you think I should have." Emily hesitated. She needed the money. She wanted to take it. But something inside her resisted. She wasn't here to beg. She was here to earn. Clint seemed to read her struggle. "Look," he said, voice calm but firm. "I respect what you're doing. You're tough. Reminds me of someone I used to know. But tough doesn't mean you have to fight alone." Emily clenched her jaw. The words hit deeper than she wanted to admit. She was alone. At least, that's how it felt most of the time. Then, before she could respond, a voice rang out from behind. "Emily?" She turned to see her mother rushing toward them, worry etched into every line on her face. "What's going on?" Emily swallowed. "Mum, I know who he is." Her mother's eyes flickered to Clint, wary yet respectful. "What's going on here?" Clint extended his hand. "Mum, your daughter's got talent. I'd like to buy some of her paintings." Her mother's eyes darted between Clint and the money in his hand. Emily knew what she was thinking. It was a lot of money. More than they made in weeks. Her mother started, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mr. Eastwood, that's incredibly generous, but we don't take charity." Clint smirked. "I don't give charity, I invest in talent." Silence stretched between them. Then another voice chimed in, one that made Emily's stomach drop. "Hey, what's going on here?" It was the same skeptical man from before, now standing with two police officers. Emily's breath caught. The officer looked at her. "We got a report about a suspicious setup, claims of a scam." Emily's heart pounded. This wasn't happening. Not now. Her mother stepped forward, instantly defensive. "My daughter is not a scammer." The officer held up his hands. "We just need to ask some questions." Emily felt her throat tighten. It didn't matter what she said. People wanted to believe the worst. But before she could say a word, Clint Eastwood turned to the officer, his presence suddenly immense. "Officer," Clint said, his voice cool but commanding. "Are you really about to interrogate a sick child trying to survive over the word of a random man who walked by?" The officers hesitated. One of them glanced at Clint, then at Emily, clearly recognizing him. The skeptical man scoffed. "Come on, you really believe this?" Clint stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Son, I've been in this world a long time. I've met every kind of person there is, and I can tell you right now, you're the one looking for trouble, not her." Emily held her breath. The officer shifted uncomfortably, then sighed. "All right. Sorry for the trouble, ma'am. You have a good day." The man gawked. "What? That's it?" But the officers were already walking away. Emily felt lightheaded with relief. Clint turned back to her and her mother. "You still think you're alone in this?" Emily swallowed hard. Maybe she wasn't. Emily's hands shook as she clutched the bundle of cash Clint Eastwood had just given her. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation, the recognition, the sheer shock that someone like him had stepped into her world. But before she could fully process it, the skeptical man who had called the police stepped forward again, sneering. "I don't buy it," he muttered. "Just because some celebrity backs her up doesn't mean she's telling the truth." Emily's stomach clenched. No matter what she did, there would always be people who doubted her, who thought she was a fraud. The humiliation burned. But before she could respond, Clint did something that no one saw coming. He turned to Emily, his sharp eyes studying her carefully, then reached for his own jacket, pulling something from the inside pocket. A small, folded-up hospital bill. Emily's breath hitched as he held it up for her and her mother to see. "I know what it's like to fight for every dollar," Clint said, his voice low, steady. "I was dirt poor before Hollywood. My family had nothing. And when my mother got sick, there was no help, no internet, no fundraisers. Just me, working odd jobs, selling whatever I could, trying to keep us afloat. Emily's vision blurred with tears. She hadn't expected this. Clint unfolded the bill slowly, his fingers running over the creased paper. Years later, even with all the success, I still remember the helplessness. His gaze locked onto her. I know you're telling the truth because I was you once. The entire street had gone silent. Even the skeptical man looked uncomfortable now, shifting awkwardly. Emily's mother brought a trembling hand to her mouth. I had no idea, she whispered. Clint exhaled, shaking his head. No one ever does. People see money, fame, success. They don't see the struggle that came before it. He looked at Emily, his expression softening. But I see you. That was it. That was the moment that shattered something inside Emily. Something she didn't even realize she had been holding on to. The fear of being seen as weak, the shame of needing help, the belief that she had to do this alone. Her chest tightened as she let out a shaky breath. For the first time since her diagnosis, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. Emily sat on the park bench, the weight of the past hour pressing down on her like a tidal wave. The crumpled bills in her hands weren't just money anymore. They were a symbol, a lifeline, a testament to the fact that someone saw her, believed in her struggle. But more than that, Clint Eastwood's words echoed in her mind. I know you're telling the truth because I was you once. For so long, Emily had convinced herself that her fight was hers alone. Even when her mother reassured her, even when kind strangers stopped to buy her artwork, there had always been a gnawing voice in the back of her mind whispering, "You're still on your own. No one truly understands." But now, someone did. And not just anyone. She exhaled shakily, looking up at her mother, who was still wiping tears from her cheeks. "Are you okay?" her mother asked, her voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded, but the lump in her throat remained. I didn't expect that." Her mother let out a breathless laugh, sitting beside her. "Neither did I. Clint Eastwood, of all people." She shook her head in disbelief. "But it wasn't just the money, was it?" Emily clutched her sketchbook to her chest. "No." She hesitated before admitting, "It was what he said. About his mother, about how no one ever sees the struggle before success. He gets it." Her mother's hand covered hers, warm and steady. "You've never had to do this alone, sweetheart." Emily swallowed hard, guilt flickering in her chest. "I know you've always been here," she whispered. I guess I didn't want you to worry more than you already do." Her mother sighed, squeezing her hand. "Emily, I'm your mother. I'll worry no matter what. But carrying this by yourself, why? You don't have to prove anything to me." Emily's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I think I was trying to prove something to myself." Her mother tilted her head, waiting. "That I'm still strong," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I'm not just sick." The words hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Then her mother did something unexpected. She laughed. Not in a cruel way, not dismissively, but softly, almost with relief. "Oh, honey," she murmured, pulling Emily into a hug. "Being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to let people in." Emily let herself sink into the embrace, the tension in her body melting. For the first time in a long time, she let go. When they finally pulled apart, Emily wiped her eyes and looked around. People were still gathered nearby, whispering about what had just happened, casting glances in her direction. A few smiled, others nodded respectfully. She had expected to feel exposed, but instead she felt lighter. A man approached hesitantly, a young father holding the hand of a little girl. He cleared his throat. "I saw what happened," he said gently, "and I wanted to buy a painting if that's okay." Emily blinked, taken aback. "Oh, yes, of course." She quickly flipped through her artwork, hands steady now, something new settling inside her. Peace. As the man handed her the money, his daughter beamed up at her. "You're really brave," the little girl said shyly. Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of those words in a way she never had before. For the first time in a long time, she believed them. Emily sat at her small art stand, the last rays of the setting sun casting a golden glow over the sidewalk. The weight in her chest, the one that had been there since her diagnosis, felt different now. Lighter, less like a burden, and more like a lesson. She traced her fingers over the worn edges of her sketchbook, remembering the moment Clint Eastwood had stopped in front of her. Not just to buy a painting, but to see her, to remind her that struggle wasn't a sign of weakness, but a part of the journey. For so long, she had felt like an invisible warrior, fighting a battle in silence, shielding her mother from her fears, believing that her pain was hers alone to carry. But now, as she looked around at the people still lingering, at the messages of encouragement pouring in after the news of her story spread, she realized she had never been alone. Her mother sat beside her, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said, nudging Emily gently, "I've never seen you look this at peace." Emily let out a quiet laugh. "It's weird, right? I should feel overwhelmed." She exhaled slowly, watching as another passerby admired her work. "But I don't. I think I finally understand something." Her mother tilted her head, waiting. Emily closed her sketchbook and looked her in the eyes. "I thought being strong meant proving I didn't need help, that I had to fight this battle alone to be worthy of winning it. But that's not true, is it?" Her mother's eyes softened. "No, sweetheart, it never was." Emily nodded, the lump in her throat no longer one of fear, but of acceptance. Strength isn't about fighting alone. It's about letting people in, letting them care. The words felt foreign on her tongue, yet right. Her mother squeezed her hand. "And that's what you're doing now." Emily smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in months. Not out of obligation, not as a mask, but because she finally felt it. Just then, a young girl hesitantly stepped forward, her tiny fingers clutching a crumpled $5 bill. "Miss," she asked shyly, "can I buy one of your paintings?" Emily knelt down, eye level with the little girl. "Of course," she said warmly. She handed over a watercolor of a sunrise, one she had painted on a day when she had desperately needed hope. The little girl's face lit up. "It's so pretty. It looks like a new beginning." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "It really does.